Start with a quote of the day, though. Now, this is an oldie but goodie. I suppose some of you have seen it already. But Winston Churchill himself said, "I am fond of pigs. Dogs look up at us. Cats look down on us. Pigs treat us as equal." Right from Mr. Churchill's mouth. So what I want to spend a couple of moments on is why it seems everything is getting settled in the courts now. What is the new reality that you folks are all in? Well, we're under increasing scrutiny, and because of that increasing scrutiny and because of activism by state and federal agencies, they've become more active in exercising an authority in a number of areas. I just listed a few of them up here, but they're all over. I've never seen in the last 10 years as many audits, examinations, and inquiries from state and federal agencies of agricultural enterprises as I have now. E.P.A., OSHA, the Department of Labor, FDA, they're all out there. Not necessarily on the big high-profile stuff, but they and their state counterparts, every time there's a complaint from somebody, you can expect to get an inquiry. So what does all of this mean for you folks? Well, and I don't mean to be patronizing, but I think it helps us to think a little bit about why this is creating such a pickle. All of this stuff that they do is supposed to be based on laws, right? Who enacts our laws? It's supposed to be our state legislatures, our county commissioners, our members of Congress. That's where the authority of the government comes from, right? And so those people are elected. They have to stand for election at regular terms. We can complain to them if we don't like what's going on and get redress by changes in the law. But what's happening is more and more administrative agencies are taking control of lawmaking. They're not supposed to do that under our system of government, but that's what's happened. They do this through a couple of ways. One way they do it is through rulemaking. So what's rules? What are rules? WOTUS, that whole mess is a rule. Antibiotics, that whole mess is a rule. Those aren't our elected representatives making reasoned decisions based on the input of all of the voters. Those are a group of people that work for an agency, maybe 1,000 miles away from where we are, who decide to create a rule to implement a law. They decide to create a rule to implement a law. There is a rulemaking process, but at the end of the day, if the rule is unreasonable, if the rule is unfair, and most importantly, if the rule departs from the congressional mandate, our recourse is to go to the courts and sue. That's why you see lawyers defending agriculture now like they never have before, because that's our recourse. Administrative agencies are making the law, and to protect vital industry interests, we end up going to court. Now, at least with rulemaking, there's a process. The rule gets published, there's comment from industry, from concerned people, it gets vetted before it becomes a final rule. But now, in kind of levels that I've never seen in all of my years of practice of law, agencies are making law through what are called preambles and through guidance documents. Preambles aren't part of the rulemaking process. It's kind of a squib that the agency puts at the beginning of the rule and says, this is what we think the rule means. Generally, they aren't supposed to have the force of law, but agencies are using them in terms of creating an interpretation that they say should go on that rule that they made, and then using that in court to enforce what they think the law ought to be. Guidance documents, those are maybe even worse. The FDA and this whole antibiotic deal is all around guidance documents. This is voluntary. You know, you guys can kind of do what you want. We're just going to express some opinions here. They don't end up being opinions very often. They end up taking a force of their own, as if they had the force of law, and then they're used in the marketplace to push agendas. So the reason that I say this is that elections matter. Elections matter. Because it's only the president and it's only the governor who gets to appoint the people that run all of these agencies. We don't get to elect them. So when we're asleep at the switch, when we aren't really committed in the electoral process, we get bad consequences for agriculture. So this all spills over into the private sector. How? How does it spill over into the private sector? A couple, three ways. Again, when I grew up on the farm, Up till about 15 years ago, you know, for public interest, we had Ralph Nader. Your car was bad. Now we've got a host of professional, non-governmental organizations that, as their reason to exist, have decided to anoint themselves with the idea of what is the best environmental practice, what is the best animal welfare practice, what is the best environmental practice. And they assert their opinions in a number of ways. They can sue, right? The environmental statutes especially have citizen causes of action authorized by law. So an interest group can say, you EPA, you're not enforcing the law the way it was intended, so we're going to sue you. And the administrative agencies are aware of that. You know, groups like the Clean Water Alliance are on the offensive looking for opportunities, provided they can get enough funds raised in Hollywood to pay for it, to attack federal agencies. And they're susceptible to that. You know, we aren't suing them like they are, and they kind of back off. You go into meetings and negotiations, and the first question is, well, how will the activists respond to this enforcement action? Not what's science, what did your guy do right or wrong, how will the activists respond? So they're lobbying, they're close by where the regulators are, where we aren't. A common tactic that they use is to start lawsuits. This is that prairie grouse deal in Oklahoma as an example. They'll start kind of an innocuous lawsuit. They'll settle with a few bureaucrats where people don't think that there's a lot to pay attention to. It doesn't seem like a significant deal, and then they use that settlement as precedent for other agency policy. So that's a significant issue. Now, fortunately, your trade groups are not asleep at the switch on this, and they're watching these things and intervening where appropriate. But it needs to be watched constantly so that things can't be done behind the scenes, if you will, or behind the back of industry in order to further positions that really aren't supported by science or not good. Publicly traded companies. The problem that we have now, and this is another one from the last 10 years, there's two things. There's social media. Cruelty to animal website, right? So somebody gets stung with an undercover video. I won't name the companies. They don't really care about the producer. All they care about is what social media says about their brand. So they'll say, we won't take anything from that guy. Shut that guy down. It doesn't matter that he or she or it may have been a loyal producer and seller for 15 or 20 years. They just don't want the buzz on the social media. Sustainability officers. In a lot of the big publicly traded corporations, the sustainability officer, quite frankly, at the top of that corporate pyramid, has more power and authority than the guys who are in charge of buying stuff from you. They have more governance authority. They're not from farms. Many of them, I don't think, this is a personal opinion, don't really have much sensitivity to what happens on the ground in agriculture, but they are making policy decisions. What this ends up doing is imposing private standards. It's not legal, but because of the power of the buyer, you got to do this, you got to do that. And it's really politicized marketplace decisions. So, with that framework in mind, and I'm going to kind of run through these pretty quickly. So we got WOTUS. I want to mention a word, and it isn't like I want to beat a dead horse. I just want to make sure that you folks understand why politics matter, why elections matter, because this is an 800-pound gorilla coming down the track. So we got the Clean Water Act. The EPA's authorities navigable waters. Doesn't define, and it's supposed to be waters of the United States. Nobody knows what that means. So it's ambiguous. It's been in the Supreme Court 3 or 4 times. They keep striking down what the EPA does because it's, as one judge said, any place where water leaves a mark, under your latest interpretation, subject to federal regulation. So, new rule gets published. Joint project between the EPA and the Corps of Army Engineers. What they decide in the new rule, there's 3 classes of water. None of us can really tell for sure where waters of the United States, hence extended regulation, begin or end, especially when it says at the end, waters that are subject to case-specific analysis. We don't know what it means. All we know is that if there's a significant nexus, it becomes the farmer's problem. Well, a significant nexus to what? An intermittent ditch that runs into Beaver Creek, that runs into the Minnesota River, that runs into the Mississippi River, that runs into the Gulf of Mexico? Is that a significant nexus? It might be. Now, I wish I can't make this slide work very well, but is there a pointer thing on here? Middle? All right. This is Minnesota, where I'm from. And this is the map, one of the maps that the EPA was forced to submit under subpoena to the United States House of Representatives as to where waters of the United States would be found. Okay? All the blue. Now, you can't see it here. You see all this? That's all red. That's our prime farm country in Minnesota. We don't really know a place in Minnesota, with just a very, very few exceptions, that wouldn't touch a water of the United States. Why is this important? When you go to get your NPDES permit 2 or 3 years from now, right? Is it going to be like, okay, there's a creek over here and we're set back from that? Or is it going to be, well, because of our new rule on waters of the United States, we need to look at the total downstream effect of the facility and manure management to see how it's impairing possibly all waters. And if it is, are we going to start creating some new guidances, some new operational directives to review permits, to tell people, you're impairing navigable water and you're going to have to impose these additional things. Now, to give my soapbox presentation, and I'll get to it when we get to the Des Moines Water Works case, the federal government, or activists in the federal government, are extremely unhappy. They've always wanted there to be a federal land use policy. Land use right now is your township, your county, and to some extent the state. You got some state environmental law, you got zoning. That doesn't sell very well with people who think, and I believe that this day is coming, that every agricultural user should have to get a permit. They're a little bit have trouble with crop farmers right now, but these are the first steps towards getting there. So that's the significance, and that's why elections matter. Oop. All right, now, antimicrobial drugs. There's lots of people here way, way, way smarter than me about this subject matter. There's just a couple of things I want to point out. Here's a guidance. See that? The use of medically important antimicrobial drugs should be limited that are considered necessary for assuring. You know what that means? I'm not sure I do. The use of medically antibiotics should be limited to those uses that include veterinary oversight, okay? It's supposed to be completely voluntary. Supposed to be completely voluntary, but they've issued it as a guidance. So when buyers of our product go into the boardroom and these discussions are happening right now, where the sustainability officer gets together with teams and say, okay, here's the guidance. I know it's not a rule yet, but what ought we to be telling our customers that we're willing to accept? These are significant. Then a second guidance. All right, guidance. Well, in order to make this better, we encourage you guys to, even though it's been approved as over the counter, we encourage you to change that because you have control of the label. Now, this is where the work of the MPPC is so important. But you know, our poor pharmaceutical partners are caught up in all the human stuff too. So this gets into brand and it gets into public pressure. And this, see that? Now that's an invitation for lobbying by activist groups, isn't it? Because they say the guidance is voluntary, but if we don't like what's happened in 3 years, we're going to come out with a new rule. Elections matter. And then there's the final feed directive rule. I want to just mention one thing on the Food Safety and Modernization Act. Everybody knows what that is here, right? There's still an open question in my mind about whether contract growers who take feed from an integrator, but it's a separate farm, whether they necessarily are able to get some of the exemptions that have appeared in the recently published final rule that says the farm, the integrated farm, doesn't necessarily have to have all of the regulatory protection. So it's something just to keep in mind. Fair Labor Standards Act, if you've got exempt employees, not going to talk about your agricultural employees, exempt employees, management people, the federal standard has been raised to $50,440 per year. So be sure and talk to your accountant or your HR person about the office people, the corporate management people you have, to make sure they're properly classified as exempt. Okay? I won't get into the recent cases on pregnancy and disability. That's for a whole nother discussion. So here, Board of Waterworks Trustees versus the City of Des Moines. Those of you from Iowa, I'm sure, have been following this, but this case has real national significance. The waterworks in Des Moines sued three drainage districts. Three drainage districts in the state of Iowa. Why did they sue them? They sued them because they said, we are having to clean up inordinate levels of nitrogen in the waterworks in Des Moines, and that's costing the taxpayers and the people of Des Moines a whole bunch of money they shouldn't have to pay. Okay? So what's the lawsuit about? Yeah, okay, there's farms, water goes downhill, what's the deal? They're saying that those drainage districts are point sources. Now, for those of you that remember your permitting, a point source needs a national discharge elimination permit in order to have authority to discharge to a water of the United States. You need to have a permit. What would that permit entail for these drainage districts? Well, they're going to have to apply for an NPDES permit. They're going to have to analyze the environmental impact of not just the hog farmers, not just the cattle farmers, but the aggregate load of all users of farmland in terms of the impact on water quality. Well, you can imagine, I talked about how do we, in the back door, get a federal land use policy? That's the way to do it. They're trying to do it through the courts. This would be a permit, if this litigation were successful, that would end up requiring a local unit of government to develop an environmental plan covering all uses, including and especially agricultural uses in its area. This is a big deal. I'm going to skip the Rose Acre Farms case. It's in your material online. Pork producers and the Farm Bureau did a good job of fighting this one off. But basically it deals with stormwater runoff. This one is the other, and this you've heard about the Chesapeake Bay stuff, okay? The litigation. This is what happened when the federal government gets involved. So 7 states went together and made an agreement. They made an agreement. We're going to try and improve the water quality of Chesapeake Bay. And under the Clean Water Act, the EPA, they do NPDES, right? The states do everything else. But they went together and made an agreement. So what happened? The EPA, pursuant to that agreement, instead of leaving it to the states, our local folks, to come up with this industry will do this industry will do this, the EPA went in and created a comprehensive, detailed, non-point source discharge rule for all uses in the state. Okay? They singled out agriculture. Very specific. Agriculture can only, and who knows what kind of science it was based on, can only load waters to X extent. To the extent that for about 3 days, an order was issued in the state of Maryland prohibiting the field application of poultry manure to any field in that state because of this. Well, Maryland's our 3rd or 4th largest poultry producing state. You can imagine common sense somewhere prevailed, and that order was overturned. But this case also is significant in my judgment because it is another step towards creating land use regulation that singles ag out and arguably places disproportionate burden on ag in terms of compliance, and compliance with things that now the federal government is deciding as opposed to our state governments. That's an appeal. Farm Bureau. I'll mention this just in passing. This case also is in litigation, and Farm Bureau and the pork producers are representing your interest here. The EPA proposed a rule, I'm going to generalize a little bit, to create a national database of all you people, right? With all kinds of information that would be accessible to the public. That rule was withdrawn in the face of huge public criticism. It was withdrawn. So what did the EPA do? They entered into an agreement with the Association of State Clean Water Administrators to say, we're kind of working on some things. Will you send us your databases, your state databases, so that we can kind of look and see, you know, what things we might improve our operations, what's going on? Well, what did they do with it? They got these spreadsheets from states all over the country with all kinds of personal, private farmer information on them, and they gave it to the environmental activists. They gave it away. So every terrorist, by animal terrorist, every person who wants to picket your farm, they'll know where your house is. In some cases, they'll know your email address, your cell phone number. I mean, this is totally out of line, and in our view, an extreme invasion of farmers' privacy for no reason that's supported by a legitimate government purpose. So that case is in litigation. And I got lots of the GMO stuff. GMO aside, the California or battery cage case. We used to think that we lived in a country that was protected by the Commerce Clause of the United States Constitution. And what that means is no state can create a law that impairs interstate commerce. In other words, the Constitution of the United States is kind of supposed to keep trade practices uniform across the country. That's now under assault in a number of states. Only California, the battery cages is only one example. There's hog crate legislation in a number of states. GMOs are a big deal. But we are looking at a situation, and litigation is what's resulting, where the United States is starting to get balkanized between states that don't have an ag interest creating statutes, but those that do. At the end of the day, so what happens if Vermont, I don't want to pick on Vermont, says, we won't take any pigs raised in maternity pens. So can Tyson sell that pork into Vermont? I don't think so. That's the issue there. I'm not going to talk about nuisance other than you guys know the mass tort guys are back in the game on nuisance. I will talk about animal cruelty. I've done about 6 of these now, the undercover video deals, and the sophistication of the equipment is quite amazing. From earrings to little cameras and ballpoint pens. We really turn things up a notch in terms of screening. I must tell you that the other side is getting more sophisticated about the screening processes, and there are people who have gotten into farms, or I suspect are in farms now, who slip through our screening processes and are probably taking undercover videos. So what's the consequence of this? Well, we know animal cruelty can be a crime, okay? And that's the latest tactic. Get an undercover video. And this was what really galls me, because there's only one law enforcement person who's done anything about this. The same people who are there to prevent animal cruelty will take videos for 3 or 4 or 5 months and not tell anybody. Now, when I went to law school, that was conspiracy in the aid and abetting of a crime. But that aside, they turn these over to law enforcement. So that creates, not just an undercover video that goes to somebody that talks about brand, but now we implicate law enforcement. And what's that poor county attorney supposed to do with all of this? You can cherry pick any set of conditions you want. It's really hard to take a sow that's just finished maternity and weaning, and if they don't go to the other side of the barn where she's gotten back into condition, right? That's the whole story. They don't do that part of it. So all I can tell you is you need to make sure that you have a screening process for this. You got public relations people to be ready to help you if something breaks. Remember the lesson on timely euthanasia, because sometimes it's just not worth it anymore. And then I think it behooves all of us to, and if one of these things hits, my advice is the first thing to do is find the independent veterinary who can go in and explain to the law enforcement people who will be going through the barn looking at all this, who've never seen a confinement barn before, but who can receive an explanation from an independent vet about, no, this is a customary business practice. This is why animals look the way they do. This is where we recondition them. That's something that you're going to have to be prepared to do if one of these things happen, because there aren't any county attorneys left who understand about raising pigs. Or I shouldn't say any, there are not very many. And they'll look to somebody, they'll hire somebody to be their expert to tell them whether is this thing really as bad as these animal rights people say it is. So that's like a whirlwind tour of issues that we're facing. It's going to really be challenging. I've never seen as many challenges in my legal and farming career. On the other hand, I'm optimistic because I don't know that I've ever seen producers more galvanized to do something about it. And I'm happy to say that the trade groups like the NPPC, its state counterparts, and Farm Bureau are really in there pitching. It's unfortunate that I'm standing up here telling you that it's got to be lawyers and lawsuits to defend your interests, but when they come and talk to you about this at your meetings, that's what's going on here, and you need their resources, and we need to support them. So thank you for listening to me today.